Okay, so for the first part of the sprint, we had to create the whole terrain thing. So I had to create the terrain asset manager, which pretty much just loads terrain, gets the terrain, and stores it in a terrain database, just like all of the other asset managers. Um, because of the Piazza comment, I'm gonna get rid of this. It's on my to-do list where I don't overwrite any of the assets. And then it just assigns it, and getting terrain is pretty much checking if it's in there. If not, it'll say you can find it and just return. So pretty much just like all the other asset managers we have. Okay, another thing to talk about is the terrain itself. It's pretty much just a terrain model with a few changes. For instance, I have instead of highlighting the sphere, I have get likely candidates, which instead of highlighting the sphere, it will return a list of everything underneath that sphere. And highlight that single terrain became is within in terrain, which just returns if a position is if a position is inside the terrain and is pretty much if it's inside the terrain, it corresponds to a cell pretty much. So get likely terrain, get likely candidates just does that highlighting stuff like I said, but instead it just puts it to a list and returns it. Um, and is within terrain, just checks if it's within the terrain. The rest is all pretty much from the last sprint. So that's pretty much just my updated terrain model. So the next thing we're supposed to do is a terrain manager. It's pretty much just setting and getting the terrain. In my case, I didn't have my terrain derived from drawable, just because it was creating a lot of problems. And this, the way of just drawing the current scene in the scene, drawing the current terrain in the scene, scenes draw was a lot easier, so I took that route. Um, and the terrain manager is pretty simple. It just gets current terrain, draws the current terrain, etc. And that's pretty much it for the terrain manager. So the last thing we were supposed to do was do the collision with the terrain and the collidable. So pretty much the registration is the same as all the other processors, so I'm not gonna go over that. But pretty much the collision test itself is the important part. First of all, it checks to see if the collidable has no group, so then we don't have to go any further. Um, then it gets the current terrain. Ignore this, that was just a debug. I forgot to get rid of that. So pretty much it goes to the list, gets the cheap sphere center, gets the radius, and then based on the collidable passed in, it'll get back the list of candidates that I talked about earlier, and then pretty much it'll cycle through the candidates, and if it hasn't already found a collision, it'll test the sphere, and then it will, after the sphere, it'll test the real test. In my case, I just have a bounding box pointer, so there's only one bounding box for the each collision terrain processor, because I found that the easiest for now, but I'll definitely clean it up, is I pretty much just create a fake ABB, which is where it changes in the minimum ABB by getting the candidates min point, so the cell's min point and max point, updating the corners so it can work with the collisions, and then I just call the test collision pair with the collision volume of the collidable and the fake AAB, which is just the AAB of the cell. And then if it did happen, it'll call the callback of the terrain collision, which is in the collidable. And that's pretty much it, I think. It wasn't too hard doing everything, but it took a while. One thing to note is, in order for my draw to work, if there is no terrain but the scene tries to draw it, it would be a problem. And I didn't want to do an if statement because that would just waste a lot. So pretty much I ended up making a class called noTerrainInstance, which is derived from terrain, and it pretty much just does nothing. Yeah. So that way, if there's no terrain, it'll still work, instead of having to call that if statement. Sorry for taking a while. Okay, so now to test that all of these things work, I pretty much loaded 2 terrains, and I have a bucket that first starts off as having no terrain, and if I press up or down it'll switch between the 2 terrains. Okay, so as you can see, no terrain, it draws, everything's fine. Now I have the actual terrain. The purple means that there's a collision. Right now I'm using the circle collider, and I just switched the terrain type, so a different one. So the asset manager loads, the current scene pointer works, and I can change things at runtime. So that works with both of the buckets, and just to show that the collision callback is working, I just have it print out the bucket. So right now there's only one colliding, and that's this guy right here. This guy's out of bounds, so he's not even considered. If I go down, you'll see now 2 memory addresses there. So it works with the multiple collidables. And this is just to show that the OOBB works. This is the OOBB. Just going at the corner, so right now I'm touching this one, and then I'm touching this one because this one's no longer the first one touching. And I just show it works within the terrain. So it always gets the collision with the first cell in the list. Although I think I heard you guys talking about the sender of the thing would be the best, but I just have it having like the standard way of just doing the first collision. The last one to test is the ABB versus terrain. So there I am, colliding. The first one should be the top left. Yep. So ABB. Okay, so this time for the demo, I thought I would try out the alarms to see how they were. So pretty much I have a game object that allows me to add or subtract time with a key. So I'm adding now in increments of 5, subtracting increments of 5. Worked pretty well. If I go to 0, I just pretty much kept subtracting, so now it's at inactive. I can't add or subtract time, and that was kind of a personal choice because I know there's 2 different types of alarms. Ones that can't be added time once they're inactive, and ones that can once they're inactive. For instance, kitchen timers as opposed to like an old alarm clock. For my engine, I decided I would have it so that you can't add more time. Instead, you would have to register. So that was registering again. One thing I thought would be really cool would be to add the ability to pause an alarm. And I haven't implemented it yet, but I've thought about it, how to do it. So I'm gonna have an array list that says is paused, and a function that says pause alarm, and pretty much and unpause. But if you pause an alarm, what that really means is you're deregistering the actual alarm marker, but you're not setting it as inactive. So pretty much this won't be set to -1, which in my case is inactive. Instead, it'll just pause it. It'll have the same time, so that later on when I unpause it, I can just pretty much register for the current time plus the time remaining in the alarm, the time trigger. And that'll give the illusion of it being paused. In a pause state, if you call subtract or add time, it'll pretty much just add it to the time trigger. And in the get time remaining of alarm, it'll just report back the alarm that the time that it was paused upon. If you try to register a paused alarm, it won't do anything because it's already registered. Or it'll register it and then count down from that. So it'll pretty much overrides the fact that it's paused. If you call deregister on a paused sound, then it's pretty much cancel. It's canceling it, so it will set this to -1, and that's pretty much all you have to do if it's in pause, because it's not registered in pause state. And that pretty much will give you pause sounds, I think. In terms of the individual project, I just pretty much thought a lot about how I wanted to organize my code, and pretty much it's the same thing I had as before, but before it didn't work because I guess I messed up or something with the with getting the sound sources correctly, as I talked about before in the other updates for the individual project. But I think at this point I have enough research to kind of actually sit down and do all of the things that I was supposed to do. And in terms of the 3D sound, I think that's probably going to be another UBL, where I have it pretty much be called like Audible, and that contains a 3D sound that has a matrix and is updated at every frame. And so when you press play on it, it'll just use that matrix as its 3D sound in 3D position in world space. And then the actual listener for the 3D listener is going to be the Azul camera, always.